A little known and much less told story about World War II is the contribution of Muslims to the Australian Army. Muslim Anzacs were a diverse group, mostly made up of migrants from Albania, Indonesia and Malaysia, who served at all levels of the military, including in combat. This is their story. From 1921 until 1939, hundreds of Albanian men entered Australia to work as labourers, especially in rural areas. These men were mostly Muslim and almost all were from villages near the city of Korça in southern Albania. These men were participating in a cultural tradition of temporary migration called kurbet.
In Albanian terms, kurbet means that you go from your own country to another country to work, learn, and bring back that knowledge back to your own home. It was never to stay.
The distance between Europe and Australia and Mussolini's annexation of Albania in 1939 meant most of the migrants were unable to return. So with the outbreak of the war, more than 20 Albanian Muslim men enlisted in the army. Men like Muharrem Ali and Leva Jamali. Like many Albanian men, Muharrem arrived in Australia as a teenager and settled in Victoria. At the outbreak of the war, Muharrem sought naturalisation as a British subject and he enlisted in early 1941, being attached to the 2nd 21st Infantry Battalion, or Gull Force. Around the same time, another, younger Albanian man from a village not too far away from Muharrem's was working on a dairy farm when he decided to enlist. His name was Leva Jamali.
He worked everywhere, but last he worked at a dairy farm. And he's milking cows by hand that time. And he worked very hard. He's been a hard work person. And he said, you have to pay a little bit more because I work very hard to the owner. And he said, no, because you're under the age, I can't pay you more. And he did get very upset, straight to Melbourne and put his name. But he's been under the age, but he lied and he put himself 1 year older.
On the other side of the country, many other Muslim men from mostly Malay and Indonesian backgrounds were also navigating life under the White Australia policy.
In early March, the lugger fleets, manned by their crews of Malays, Kopangers, Aborigines, Chinese and an occasional European, speed out to start the year's fishing.
When you look at the experiences of a whole lot of those pearling workers, that they're often through White Australian eyes, they're seen as kind of, they're just workers and so on. But in fact, these are people who are already really highly motivated. They're kind of adventurers. So you think about going out from your island, going to Australia to work in a relatively dangerous industry. These are people who already have a strong sense of what they want to do and I guess a hard work ethic.
At the outbreak of World War II, and with a rising Japanese threat to their north, most of the Malay and Indonesian pearl divers were evacuated south and recruited into home defence units. Several of these men, like Samsudin bin Khattab and Abu Qasim bin Marra, were later recruited into Special Operations Australia for service behind enemy lines.
Early in the history of SOA or Z Special Unit operations, there were a lot of extremely unsuccessful, even disastrous operations where men were killed because, it's not surprising really. They were going into Timor or they were going into wherever else, not speaking the local language, not looking at all like the locals, looking very white. It's going to be very difficult for you to sort of, infiltrate local populations and gain the kind of intelligence that you need. So they realised that they actually needed to get locals, people who looked local, people who looked Asian or who looked Pacific, people who spoke local languages into Z Special Unit. So they recruited Malay pearl divers. They could go into Borneo and look like locals in a way that these, big lumbering white guys simply couldn't do. And I think there's a huge sort of irony in here that this was the time of the White Australia policy, and yet these people were being recruited into what was in effect a highly elite Australian military unit and expected there to perform extremely brave and daring tasks, which indeed they did with great success. He was a Malay from Malaya. He came to the Broome area sometime in the, I think, early to mid-1930s as a pearl diver. Then in 1944, he was actually recruited to Z Special Unit, Special Operations Australia. And I'm pretty sure that he was recruited to Special Operations Australia specifically to take part in Operation Samut.
Leva Jamali was attached to the 13th Rifles of the 2nd 23rd Battalion and sent to North Africa. Muharrem Ali was sent to his unit, Gulf Force, which had been languishing in Darwin without an assignment for nearly a year. Finally, the order came. Gulf Force was to embark for the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia.
Gulf Force was sent to Ambon the 9th of December 1941 to reinforce the Dutch forces that were already on the island.
Leva Jamali's time in the Middle East was short-lived, as the fall of Singapore led Prime Minister John Curtin to withdraw Australian troops from North Africa and Europe and reassign them to the Pacific to stop the Japanese advance. It was into this storm that young Rem Ali was now sailing. Rem Ali and his unit were on Ambon for barely a month when the Japanese started attacking.
And then on the, I think the 10th of January, the Japanese started bombing. So they had a few bombing ranges just to sort of soften them up a bit.
The men of Gulf Force would spend the next 3 years in brutal conditions in POW camps. Rem Ali remained on Ambon in the Tantui camp. By the end of the war, 77% of the men had died, the second highest mortality rate for Australian soldiers in the POW camp in the Second World War, second only to Sandakan.
At first it wasn't too bad. They had a relative freedom of movement, which they enjoyed. But then after a while things started to change. They were forced to do work parties. The food rations were cut and there was no medical assistance whatsoever. My dad said if they had had medical supplies at the start, another 300 of them would have survived easily.
While Rem Ali languished in captivity, Leva Jamali was about to face his own encounter with the Japanese in Papua New Guinea.
You were always wet. You were never, ever, ever dry. And he goes, it would rain that if you didn't hold something over your head, you would drown. There was that much water coming down on top of you, and you just sat there, and you couldn't do anything about it. He goes, and the leeches and stuff would be at you. You'd get foot rot, stuff like that. You couldn't go anywhere. You just had to sit there and wear it.
Leva was sent to the front line and the fierce fighting at Wario. At this time, Australian troops had stopped the Japanese advance at Kokoda and were now advancing against their enemy.
He goes, I couldn't believe, like really big, strong men would fall apart. He goes, it'd be night time, in the heat of battle, bullets flying around, explosions and stuff, and you'd have people just breaking down, crying for their mothers, screaming, stuff like that. He goes, and I used to run forward. He goes, and lobbing hand grenades and saying, "Give me more grenades, give me more grenades," because to him he was enjoying it to a degree. And he goes, an old sergeant pulled me up one day and said, "My boy, one day you'll feel this." And he goes, he was right. Later on in life, like Anzac Day, he would get very emotional.
Leva's time at the front line was brought to an end by both the Japanese and the jungle. First, he was wounded in action by a Japanese grenade.
He said when he got wounded, the way he mentioned it, a grenade landed near him. I think he was injured in the leg or something, I think.
Then shortly after, he contracted malaria.
Like he was obviously very sick, and he did mention, the doctor said when he saw him, he said, you should be dead. He couldn't believe that he actually survived it. He reckons my temperature, it was 100, well over 100 sort of thing, He was huge.
Meskipun pada pagi itu hujan turun lebat sekali.
As Leva Jamali was evacuated back to Australia, Samsuddin bin Khattab and Abu Qasim were entering a new theatre of war in special forces behind enemy lines in Borneo.
The Japanese had invaded Borneo in late 1941, early 1942, and by 1944 the Allies were making plans to invade Borneo in turn and retake it from the Japanese. And it was specifically the Australians who were going to lead this invasion. So they were planning for the invasion to take place, the first landings to take place in June 1945. So in 1944, they began planning for special operations parties to go into Borneo in advance of the invasion. They knew nothing about Borneo. They had almost no information about it at all. And Operation Semut was one of these operations that was planned to take place in advance of the invasion. And the first men were parachuted in to the Kelabit Plateau in the sort of high mountainous central region of Borneo in March 1945. And Operation Semut was actually tasked with two main things. On the one hand, gaining intelligence about where the Japanese were and so on, and they had radios with them, so the idea was that they could radio this information back to the Australian headquarters. But they were also tasked with recruiting the indigenous, or the local people, especially the indigenous Dayak people, to join the operation and to form guerrilla armies that would then fight the Japanese. Semut 3 broke off from Semut 2 and crossed the Dulit Range to reach the headwaters of the Rajang River. Abu Qasim was absolutely crucial in this journey. Abu Qasim was the person who was constantly being sent forward to go into Balaga to find out whether the Japanese were there, to negotiate with locals. Because he looked like a local, he was left in Balaga, sort of administer, I suppose, and organise the local population.
Samsudin joined Special Forces in March 1944 as a corporal. He was then deployed to Borneo to gather intelligence ahead of the Allied invasion on July 1st, 1945. While Samsudin and Abu Qasim were liberating Borneo, Rem Ali was suffering under the yoke of the Japanese guards in Ambon.
They were forced to carry bombs, unload the Japanese supply ships. They were forced to carry 250-pound bombs from the ship up into a bomb dump just up in the hills a little bit. Just really hard work, day in, day out, with virtually no food. You might get half a cup of rice a day, half a cup of rice a day. That was about all.
One soldier who survived the war, Ted Winnell, later wrote of his memories of Rem during this time.
My father knew Rem Ali. He was on a work party with him one day, and this is what my dad wrote in his memoirs. Rem Ali was an Albanian serving in the Australian Army. He had a very deep voice and a very deep, jovial laugh. He was built as strong looking as a Clydesdale. His massive arms and legs gave the impression that he once may have been a weightlifter. We were working in a long tunnel. The only illumination was a candlelight. The candles were big chunks of wax that I think were beeswax. As the day went on, the lights in the tunnel became dimmer. Rem had a big frame to fill and was doing his best to supplement his diet by eating the candles. Eventually a Jap caught up with him, passed out a few hits on the face. Whenever he could, he often ate handfuls of raw rice.
Sadly, Rem Ali did not survive the conditions of Tantui. He died of beriberi disease caused by starvation on the 30th of April 1945, just 4 months before liberation. His comrades buried him on Ambon. Samsudin and Abu Qasim returned from the war expecting to be rewarded for their service.
A whole lot of the pearling workers were promised citizenship or naturalisation, and even some of them were promised housing and so on when they joined Z Force, and all of those promises were not honoured.
Abu Qasim, my understanding is, came back from Borneo very late 1945. He went back to the Perth area. I think he tried to get naturalised and was one of the people who wasn't able to get naturalised. My understanding again is he came back from the war ill. I've heard that he came back from the war and was very quickly diagnosed with leukemia, and in fact died in 1949. He was buried in an unmarked grave. His contribution was never recognised. We know that he left children behind in the Broome area.
When Samsudin applied for naturalisation, it was realised that he was still indentured to the pearling industry and he was forced to return to Broome. With his experience of unions from his time in Melbourne and with the support of the Indonesian freedom movement, he campaigned for better working conditions.
He'd been able to basically unionise and to mobilise a whole lot of the workers in the industry.
Attempts by Samsudin, Abu Qasim and others to gain naturalisation faced an immigration regime that was bent on maintaining a white Australia.
The 1940s is also the period when Caldwell was the Minister for Immigration, and he's really keen to just basically get everybody who's not white out of the country.
Despite repeated interventions from his friends and appeals to the government for his war service, Samsudin was deported from Australia in 1948 and is believed to have died in Singapore 2 years later. For Laver Jamali, who survived the war, going back to his normal life was straightforward, but forgetting about the war was hard, and he stayed away from commemorations.
For whatever reason that he couldn't do the ceremony, but he was definitely a returned serviceman and he was definitely a proud ex-Australian soldier, absolutely.
When he passed away in 1991, Laver Jamali was one of the first, if not the first, returned servicemen to be buried in a Muslim grave. Unlike other Muslim soldiers who died in battle and were buried, sometimes with no emblem on their grave, or a cross, as with Rem Ali, Laver Jamali's headstone bears the Crescent of Islam.
They notified us because he died at the Repat Hospital, and we got a letter from the department saying, as a returned soldier, we'd like to erect his grave and give him a proper military service. And there was a form there to fill in with name and whatever inscriptions that you want on the plate and stuff. And then there was the religious symbol, and it had the crucifix and the Star of David. And I thought, well, he wasn't a particularly good example of one, but he was a Muslim nevertheless. So I wrote him back and said, listen, thank you very much, but Dad was indeed a Muslim, and so thank you, but we'll just erect our own grave. And we got a prompt response saying, we apologise profusely, we didn't know, as this is the first time we will have ever buried a Muslim. Just give us a bit of time to research this and we'll get back to you. And they went away and they did their research and came back with a proper formatted Star and Crescent.
And Albanian people, they appreciate very, very much, because he's been in a war and he fight for this country, and really they've been proud, like Albanian, what he done. Yeah, no, I can respect too, Papa. They
did.
They respect him.
I remember telling people that Dad fought for Australia, and they were shocked. They couldn't believe that an Albanian. Well, wasn't he? Oh, no, he definitely was for Australia, and that was always a point of shock for people when I tell that story.